When the world remembers World War II, they think of Europe, the beaches of Normandy, the skies above Britain, and the islands of the Pacific. But far to the south, in the deserts and jungles of Africa, another war raged, an epic struggle that history almost forgot. Millions of soldiers, many of them African, fought and died on battlefields that would vanish from memory, leaving scars that still echo today. Who were they, and why does their story remain hidden? This is Africa at War. Close your eyes and picture North Africa in 1941. Endless golden sands stretch to the horizon, interrupted only by rocky outcrops and the shimmering heat of the sun. Italian tanks crawl across the desert like slow-moving predators, while British soldiers huddle in foxholes, their faces blackened by dust and sweat. Far away, in the jungles of East Africa, thick vines and towering trees hide a different kind of enemy: disease, hunger, and a war that was just as deadly as any bullet. These lands were not passive backdrops, they were active battlefields, shaping the strategies, the suffering, and the stories of men and women caught in the world's greatest conflict. But Africa's war was unlike any other. It was a war of colonizers, of empires stretching across continents, and of the countless African men and women who were pressed into service: soldiers, carriers, spies, and laborers, whose names would rarely appear in history books. Historians have long debated, why is Africa's role in World War II so overlooked? Battles that shaped the outcome of the war, that altered the fates of empires, remain almost invisible in the grand narrative. In Ethiopia, Kenyan highlands, and the deserts of Libya and Egypt, African soldiers faced the impossible. Yet for decades, their bravery and suffering were eclipsed by the stories of Europe. How could a continent that contributed so profoundly to the war be written out of history? What happened in these forgotten fronts, and who survived to tell the tale? But what happened next would shock historians and challenge everything we thought we knew about the war. Africa in the early 20th century was a continent under foreign rule. From the deserts of Libya, controlled by Italy, to French West Africa, British East Africa, and Portuguese colonies in Angola and Mozambique, African lands were pawned in the imperial games of Europe. But beneath the surface, complex societies thrived. In Ethiopia, proud kingdoms resisted colonization. In Nigeria and Ghana, vibrant communities balanced traditional governance with colonial impositions. And in North Africa, ancient trade routes carried goods, stories, and secrets that stretched back millennia. When World War II erupted in 1939, Africa was not a passive observer. Its resources, minerals, labor, and strategic ports were suddenly vital. Millions of African men were conscripted, often unwillingly, into the armies of Britain, France, Italy, and Portugal. They fought not for their own freedom, but for empires that had long denied them basic rights. From the sands of the Western Desert Campaign to the mountains of Ethiopia, African soldiers marched, dug trenches, and loaded artillery under the unrelenting sun. Yet as these soldiers gave their sweat and blood, history would later paint them as footnotes, mere background extras in a European drama. And yet, in those hidden fronts, extraordinary acts of courage unfolded. Stories of entire battalions marching hundreds of miles through deserts with barely a drop of water. Ethiopian patriots defeating Italian mechanized divisions. African laborers carrying artillery across impossible terrain. These were the unsung heroes whose stories have been buried beneath the weight of empires. The war reached Africa in a storm of violence and strategy. In North Africa, the Western Desert Campaign became a deadly chessboard. The German Afrika Korps, led by the brilliant Erwin Rommel, clashed with British forces composed of African regiments from Sudan, Nigeria, and South Africa. The desert sands became a graveyard for men and machines alike. Tanks burned, camels collapsed under the heat, and soldiers wrote letters home they knew would never be read. East Africa saw an even different struggle. In 1940, Italian forces invaded British-controlled Sudan and Kenya, but the response was swift and brutal. African soldiers, alongside British officers,
launched counteroffensives across mountainous terrain and dense forests, facing not only enemy fire, but deadly diseases, hunger, and exhaustion. Every village, every ridge became a battlefield. Local knowledge became a weapon. A hidden network of spies, mostly African, provided intelligence that European commanders could not have imagined. And then there was the Congo, the mines of South Africa, and the ports along the Atlantic coast. Africa was not one front, it was many, stretching thousands of miles, each with its own horrors, heroes, and tragedies. Millions were uprooted, families torn apart, and communities forever changed. Yet when the guns fell silent in 1945, the continent's role was largely ignored. But the truth of Africa's war is even more shocking, hidden in diaries, letters, and oral histories that challenge everything we thought we knew. Recent historical research has begun to illuminate these forgotten fronts. In Libya, we now know that African soldiers made up nearly half of the British Eighth Army, holding the line at El Alamein in a battle that would turn the tide against Rommel. In Ethiopia, a network of African patriots helped defeat the Italian occupation in 1941, using guerrilla tactics that combined knowledge of the land with courage that defied conventional armies. West African soldiers fought in Burma, thousands of miles from home under blistering heat and in monsoon rains. They carried weapons, ammunition, and medicine, often suffering casualties at higher rates than their European counterparts. Yet their sacrifices were unrecognized for decades. Monuments were erected in Europe, streets named after generals, but few acknowledged the African soldiers who had marched, fought, and died. Even more haunting are the stories of African laborers, conscripted to move supplies across deserts, forests, and rivers. They carried artillery, food, and water for armies that never thanked them. Entire battalions vanished, leaving only skeletal remains and whispered stories in remote villages. Their courage was real. Their suffering was real. And for the first time, we are beginning to hear their voices through letters, oral histories, and newly discovered archives. These revolutions force us to confront a difficult truth. Africa was not a bystander in World War II. It was a battlefield, a supplier, a strategic lifeline, and most importantly, a crucible of human courage that has been nearly erased from memory. Why does this matter today? Because the story of Africa at war is not just history. It is a story about humanity, resilience, and injustice. It reminds us that the narratives we accept are often shaped by those in power. It reminds us that heroism is not always celebrated, and that the fight for recognition can last for decades, even centuries. The descendants of African soldiers and laborers carry the legacy of bravery and sacrifice. Their grandparents fought for empires that denied them freedom, yet they endured, adapted, and survived. These hidden histories shape Africa's identity, its role in the world, and its understanding of its own past. Every dusty battlefield, every lost diary, every unmarked grave speaks to a truth that cannot be silenced. Africa was at war, Africa bled, and Africa's story is one that demands to be told. As we uncover these forgotten fronts, we see not just the horrors of war, but also the triumphs of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. We see communities that resisted, that strategized, that endured. And we see a continent whose courage and contribution to global history has finally begun to reclaim its rightful place. History may have overlooked Africa's battlefields, but we cannot. The deserts, the jungles, the mountains, they remember. And as we remember, we honor the men and women whose names were lost, whose stories were silenced, and whose courage changed the course of a world war. This is Africa at war. Forgotten fronts, unforgettable sacrifices. If you've been moved by these stories, if you want to uncover the hidden histories that shaped our world, subscribe to EmpyraVault. Because the past is not just to be remembered, it is to be witnessed.